Hello, and welcome to another plus-sized kite review, where in today's much-requested episode, I do my best to cover the new Core Pace Pro. As a Core Kite owner myself, with XR6 and 7s in my old quiver, and some experience using my father's Nexus 4s, I believe, I do have a fair bit of experience with the brand and general feel of the previous kites, albeit from a few years back. So since this kite first started to appear on the competition circuit right from its prototype phase, I have been super excited to give it a blast. Not to mention the sales pitch Core and its team have been promoting about its performance since release. The idea of potential XR level power in an easier to use model with friendlier loops just sounded like my potential dream kite, to be honest. But of course dreams are free, and kite reality I seem to find time and time again is that if you improve one area of performance, you are usually going to have to sacrifice somewhere else. But by how much is always a question, especially with top-end Alula price tags. One more item of note though before we get into the riding. I should also mention this delicious kite was purchased from Mike McDonald's shop at bigairkite.com, so go check that out. It's a great site with a destination guide I particularly like to browse and some fun merch. And if you've ever been to Cape Town for a big air season, their shop in Dolphin Beach Hotel is pretty epic as well, and definitely worth a visit before your session at the iconic spot. As I mentioned in several videos before, I love the work that Mike does for the industry, and to be honest, Core in general seem to consistently put out some of my favorite YouTube content, between Mike himself and Steven Eckersdike doing the bulk of the best how-tos for the more advanced level riding. Also formerly Anton Chernyshov, known as Advocate, who used to do some great big air jump progression stuff, and I think he was also a teacher in Cape Town. So I'll put some links to their channels in the description below. They even have a vlogger I quite enjoy, Ben Beehles, who's always popping up in cool locations to shoot fun-looking sessions that seem to add more spots to my kite bucket list. Now, with that all aside, let's get on to the riding. I've managed to log about 4 hours of ride time in total on the Pace, spread out over 3 sessions in varying wind strengths. And with each session, I have either been able to compare it right away to some of the other top kites I've been riding lately, or by riding with a group of friends of similar level and size on kites where I know how well they can perform, particularly in terms of power, comfort level, tricks, etc. So although I have a pretty good idea how this kite compares with my own experience, for the sake of accuracy for this review, I'm actually going to cheat a little bit and use some feedback of a buddy of mine who actually owns the kite I tried. This here is Dave, aka Sliderman, aka Darkslide Dave, aka The Shepherd, who had his first session with me on his 9-meter Pace right here in New Zealand, but since then has also been riding a quiver of them for the last couple months in perhaps the most ideal circumstances to review mid to strong powered winds, having been in the northern lagoons and beaches of northeast Brazil. Now, for me here in New Zealand, the 3 sessions I had on this Pace were a bit of a mixed bag with winds, starting with a slightly up and down 20 to 30 knot session at Muriwai, where you would have seen a lot of my reviews come from. Then, weeks later, a fairly disappointing 20 to 25 knot session at a spot in Auckland called Takapuna. And then finally, a glorious 2 hours in 25 to 35 knots of banging wind at a local flatwater spot we call Miola, which is a spot we all love here in Auckland but rarely get big winds for because it requires a direction from the northwest that rarely delivers in Auckland, sadly. With a new kite, I will also just mention there is a cool new Core bar, the Sensor 4 Pro, which you do sadly need to upgrade to if you are going to be using this Pace, at least if you want full safety flag-out options available while you ride. As I have mentioned before in my previous videos, I think the Sensor 3 Pro is one of the best bars on the market in terms of functionality and ease of use, with my only dislikes about being that I'm not a fan of the grip and that the parts need regular replacement. I found every 8 months or so. With this Sensor 4, the grip has improved a little bit, and there is a lot of cool detail in its overall design, but it does seem a little bit more complicated, which I am assuming is to make it compatible with both old and new Core Kites. For example, if you look here, count the 4 center lines coming through the bar up to where the high Y split is. It seems like overkill, but I guess it was the only way they could make it work with both pulley and non-pulley bridle kites in the whole Core range. It does seem to create a little bit of added drag, but not significant. I just found it a bit annoying to set up mainly, so a little bit more mindfulness when laying out the lines and you'll be all good to go. So here we get onto our first session on the water, which was actually both Dave and I's first time trying the kite. It was nice and fresh out the bag, which is always a blast, but unfortunately it wasn't really the best intro to this kite for us for a few reasons. Mainly though the lack of wind we discovered for this 9-meter size to really make it sing, even though the average was around 22 to 25 knots and it was gusting 30 at times. So Dave started out on his new pace, of course, to christen it with a maiden send, and I started out on the Slingshot NXT, which is a must-watch review I've done recently, as I figured this would be a great first comparison kite for the pace, based on the information we'd been given so far about it and the way it was marketed. But despite me being at least 15 kg heavier than Dave, it seemed I was noticeably more powered than he was. And then when we swapped kites, the reverse was in effect. The NXT provided better low end when the wind was in the low 20s, and more lift and hang time when the wind was strong enough to do some decent jumps. While I was on the pace, my first impressions were of course that it lacked the low end I was expecting from an Alula kite. A gripe I also had with the Orbit Ultra if you've watched that video. But I was also not thrilled with how the kite felt through the bar, in that it felt a bit heavier on the bar and a bit more heavy to maneuver compared to the NXT, and it didn't feel quite as direct as I would have hoped for. On the plus side, however, the kite was very fast, particularly through the loops, far faster than the NXT, but because of the bar being possibly the heaviest Alula kite I've flown, probably even heavier than the recent North Orbit Ultra I reviewed. Like with the Ultra, it was challenging to get your timing right and get a good feel for the correct amount of pressure to use in that first session. So I would often overdo it, and it made getting the timing quite challenging. To such a point, it really sapped my confidence to try any tricks with the kite on this session, other than a few basic boosts and loops. I even crashed a simple standard loop with the kite when it didn't give me too much of a catch on the heli loop. A little bit because I oversent it, but I also just didn't find it very forgiving on the helis. So I ended up hurting myself a bit in a way that lingered for a few weeks and cost me at least one more potential 9-meter testing day on this kite, sadly. Thankfully, with the wind that day, it was at least gusting up to 30 knots at time, so the session wasn't a total failure for reviewing, and I was able to jump over 10 meters and get some decent loops in, like this one around 12 meters. But I didn't really enjoy the first session on the kite, at least not to compare to some of the recent kites I've reviewed, where I just wanted to stay on them for hours, in very similar strength winds to this. I got about 45 somewhat frustrating minutes on the pace, then decided to just go back to the NXT where I had a blast. And I actually gave Dave my 10-meter Evo D-Lab to make the most of the wind we had, because this was also his first time in New Zealand and his first session ever at Mirwai, so we wanted to make it a good one. That initial feel was somewhat reminiscent of my experiences with my XR7s. If you go back and watch that first comparison video of mine, I talk about that when I use them, even though I own the kites, it would always take me a good half hour to get used to how they fly. Particularly coming from my other quiver of Orbits, mainly because of the bar pressure and its relationship to the speed and power of the kite. With this Core pace, although the pressure is certainly a lot lighter than those older XR7s, it still feels heavier than what else I've been riding and testing lately, which is not a characteristic I particularly love with Core kites, if I'm honest. I assume it must just be something that core riders love or have something to do with the way they perform, because it has always been something I associate with their kites. So to some extent it makes sense that they couldn't make this model too much different at the risk of upsetting their loyal customer base. Coming from other kite brands, it's just a very unique and challenging feature I don't really understand, to be honest. Because we didn't love our initial experience with the Pace, we actually didn't bother to take it out with us for a few more sessions, because I also had other kites ready to test, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep going with this review. So it took me another month or so before I could get back out on the Pace, once I had finished the Thrive review, which I really enjoyed making. And in that time, Dave headed off to Brazil for a few months of riding there. With him gone, I was lucky enough to borrow another 9-meter Pace from a local rider here in Auckland for the next few sessions. And as I mentioned, I'll also cover Dave's experiences so far with his quiver. Moving on to my second session on the Pace, unfortunately another one that wasn't ideal for it, as the wind was only around 20 to 27 knots, and although my friends were riding around on their 9-meter orbits, and I did go for a larger board to help a little, the Pace just wasn't enough for me to do very much, except test how low I could safely send some loops, basically. Once again, the weight of the kite through the bar made it require a little more effort than I was used to, so the session was not so enjoyable either and only lasted a half hour. But I must say it was quite impressive how little height you needed to loop the kite cleanly. Finally, here we go with session number 3, and we got a proper 25 to 35 knots, so things were really looking exciting to get a legit feel for what this kite was all about, and I must say I was finally really excited about getting it out on the water. Now, after the safest launch in all of Auckland, you can see from this initial footage of me riding upwind to the spot that the wind is pumping, and the kite is just dying to shoot forward into the window, which is always a good indication of how well it's going to shoot up to 12 if you can get your timing down with ascend. Although I must say it was a bit nerve-wracking going out because of how much this kite was moving around, and how challenging I found controlling it. Like with my XRs, if you are not used to it, the added weight on the bar, the speed of the kite, and the slightly less direct feel can give you the impression the wind may be a bit stronger than it is at times too, and it just takes a bit of getting used to. During the more lit parts of this session, I certainly felt like I finally had a lot of power on this kite, and the weight and energy coursing through my hands as I rode around on it finally made me feel like I could imagine it being designed by the descendants of large northern Viking types, likely burying their axe in the skulls of lesser town folk. With that power and this wind, I had no trouble jumping in the 15 to 8 meter range, with my highest loops coming in around the 12 to 14 meter range in height. I also tested a variety of different types of loops, some smaller with a higher kite angle, to see if it would give me confidence to try some rotations on the kite. And although the loops themselves didn't have a ton of power on them, for me the kite still felt somewhat erratic and hard to get the timing down. My perceived response from the bar to the kite felt less direct than some of the recent kites I've ridden, perhaps due to the relationship between the bar pressure and the speed of the kite. And the kite's speed, of course, is incredibly quick. As I mentioned, like the Orbit Ultra, the bar pressure to kite speed just feels tricky to get the hang of for me. But at least with this Pace, the pull of the kite is a lot less, I believe, than the Orbit Ultra. So I would say you could get a bit more confident on it quicker once you got used to that pressure and response time. I was finding that with the excellent speed of the kite, if I could get the timing right, I would aggressively shoot off the water for some decent height in my jumps, but then I wasn't finding there was too much added gifted lift like I would get from my Evos or perhaps the NXT, for example. So in this session, although I was riding it pretty lit, I wasn't really getting any more height relative to my friends on their orbits. I think in this session I'd have actually gotten more height if I had been on my 8 meter Evo D-Lab or NXT, and possibly more if I was on another 9 meter like the Thrive or the Fly Surfer Era, to be honest. But that could just be due to challenges I have with controlling this kite. I was also having a bit of trouble figuring out the right technique for safe and easy catching heli loops. Like the Harlem kites, particularly the Force, because the kite loops so tightly, if you just go for a high and tight heli loop above your head, you seem to get almost no lift as you descend, so you can fall out of the sky a bit even while you're going through the heli loop. So it's quite important to either send the kite a little wider for a larger swooping heli loop, or I was also finding I could get a little bit of lift with the high and tight loops if I sheeted out and then sheeted back in quickly after the loop to force a little bit of lift as I re-engage the bar after the loop. To put it frankly, even on this lit session, I still just struggled with this kite and didn't really have the best time because frankly it made me feel like I was suddenly much worse at kiting and my skills and confidence had regressed. But I was determined to get footage and really try my best to understand the kite. However, despite 2 hours on the water, I did come off just having not really enjoyed myself. Perhaps a little bit given how much my friends were all having stoked with the session's conditions at this spot we don't get to ride so often. It was after this session that I had another good chat with Dave about he was finding the kites after 2 months of riding them, and thankfully he has had a much better experience than I did with my sessions, so that's why I'm going to get a lot of his feedback as well. Dave has come from a quiver of orbits and a couple of ocean rodeo flights, I believe, and upgraded to this pace quiver with 8, 9, 10, and 12 meter kites. And here's the feedback he's given me. Although it also took him some time to get used to the bar pressure and the flight pattern, he has found that he particularly loves both the 10 and 12 meter paces so far, likely because he has also found that he basically needs to go a kite size up from what everyone else is riding where he is, which means if they are all going 9 meter in 20 to 35 knots, he's taking the 10. The adjustment has meant that he is seeing good improvements in his height, about 2 to 3 meters from what he would have expected to get on his orbits in the same conditions and same kite size. He loves how fast the kite moves and gets around the loops, even on the slower wingtip sessions, especially in the larger sizes. Regardless of the size he is riding, compared to the orbit, he is finding the kites do have quite a yank, so he's finding it can be both fun but a bit intimidating as well. He's not being super stoked on the low end or hang time, mind you. As someone who specializes in board off related tricks, he's finding he really needs to rush that board back on at times when he's not staying in the air as long as he'd like. In terms of progression, he's made a lot since he's been there and riding these kites. Perhaps, of course, because of the added height, but it's also likely because of the conditions he's in being quite perfect a lot of the time. In my opinion, I think he would have had improved just as much, if not more, on most of the other kites I've been trying recently, but he is very happy with the results and he is happy with his purchase in the larger sizes in particular. He's heading off to Cape Town next, so he will get a little bit more time to test the 8 and 9, which he's not loved so far, but I believe he is considering swapping the 8 meter to an XR Pro or something else with a bit more power to be able to get more height in that size. He'll likely also add a 6 meter pace to his quiver to improve his double loop game. So with his feedback and my experiences, let's cover the main aspects of the kite and their ratings. So first off, boosting, and as we both found, not bad at all, but not quite up there with the top tier boosters. The kite does have some XR feel to it and can really power you off the water, so it has a lot of potential for technically sound riders, but it doesn't make it easy unless you're quite in tune with it. I would say it has more potential than your standard orbits or orbit pros, but perhaps not quite as much as that tier with the kites like the Era, Thrive, or Vortex, so perhaps similar to the Orbit Ultra. It isn't that great either in the hang time department, as we both mentioned, so probably not the ideal kite for pure air style or board off progression, as Dave has pointed out, unless you are already proficient there. For looping, well, this is where the kite gets its top marks and really shines. And after the Harlem Thrive or Force, I would say it's the fastest looping kite I have tested. But I did find it a bit more technical to use in terms of your timing for some of the issues I mentioned earlier. And with the nature of its heli loops and timing safe catches, I wouldn't put it as one of the better kites to get into kite loops with, more to progress once you're already there. Unless, of course, you're coming from kites like the XR, which, of course, is dramatically easier to loop on than the XR. For confidence building, well, again, not really great marks from me after only a few sessions. You can see in the last sessions, I didn't even feel confident jumping in both directions, but I do have to bump it up in the ratings because of Dave's feedback and his experiences after a lot more time on the kite. So perhaps not an ideal kite to just demo only once, but if you stick with it, you'll hopefully be rewarded for that time spent adjusting to its style. In terms of fun factor, well, Dave is clearly having a blast on his 10 and 12, but I can't say I really enjoyed the few sessions I had on the 9. Perhaps I was just not dialed in enough to it yet, so once again, a bit of mixed reviews here. So in summary, although high performance and a great debut for a new model kite that already has a world champion in Zara Hugenrad riding it, this kite really feels like something designed for those higher level riders who really love that core feeling, or perhaps are coming from an older model kite looking to get into their first Alula kites. But it may likely be a bit of a handful to get used to for riders coming from other top tier modern performance Alula kites, or just looking to progress into big air. Because of my limited time on this pace, it's hard for me to say if it is very versatile for other disciplines. I don't think it would work so well for freestyle, nor non-looping freeride, where you probably want to go for the Core XR from the range instead. So for me, it's best used as a more technical loop progression machine. If you already have a moderate level of skill. I have been thinking that if I had not tested some of the last few kites I've done, that I would like it a lot more. And if I'm being self-critical, this kite just needed a lot more time from me to give it a fair shake, I think. But that is time with the lack of wind we've had lately that I don't really have to spare, especially when I didn't really love the sessions I did have. And I might be overly critical here, but I have come to the conclusion that for me personally, if I'm paying for Alula prices, I either want the highest jumping, the largest wind range, the most versatile, or perhaps the easiest to use for the extra money. If you look at, say, the Evo D-Lab, that kite sure isn't one of the easier to use, but it's certainly one of the highest boosting and probably has the best wind range of any kite in the market. So I get a lot more sessions out of the respective sizes. And even after a year, I still feel like I'm getting a lot of added performance for the stupid amount of money I spent on my quiver. I can say as well that based on the many dozens of DMs I've received since I posted some clips of me testing this kite, that a lot of other riders have been finding similar experiences to Dave and I. Some absolutely love this kite, and I can kind of see why, but others being a bit more like me who recognize its performance potential, but just don't find it very easy or fun to get the hang of. So if you have any experiences and you think I've been too critical, or even if I've been fair in this review, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments. And as always, if you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe, and you can check out my Instagram to see what I'm currently testing when the wind permits it. So until next time, goodbye.